This video is all about using a code debugger with Unity. And both MonoDevelop and Visual Studio provide a debugger. And what a debugger does is it allows you to pause your code while your game is running, and then run your code line by line to see what's really happening. Now, C# and Unity are good at throwing errors when something goes wrong, and that can help you sort of quickly zero in on what's going wrong with your code. But many times, the issue that's causing your error is actually happening somewhere else in your code, and being able to walk through the code in a bit more detail can help you more quickly spot the error. And other times, you may have an error in your game that's quite a bit more subtle. It doesn't actually throw an error to the console, but rather you get behavior that's just wrong, like a character that repeatedly runs into a wall when they should be jumping over it. And these types of errors are often called algorithm errors, or sort of errors in the logic of how you've constructed your code, and they're a lot harder to track down, so having the debugger can really help with those. So the basic way that the debugger works is that you can set breakpoints in your code. And these are going to be places where you want to pause your game and examine it in a little bit more detail. You can set a breakpoint by clicking in the column to the left of the numbers. So for instance, click there. And this works, by the way, the same both in MonoDevelop and also in Visual Studio. So I can just click over to the left anywhere in my code. Now, one thing to note is that you can only set a breakpoint where something is actually happening in your code. So if you try and set a breakpoint on a blank line or on a line with a comment, that's not going to be called. So you want it to be lines where something is actually being executed. Once you choose your breakpoints, decide where you want to pause your code, you're then going to need to attach the debugger in MonoDevelop or in Visual Studio to your running instance of Unity. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the Unity editor is running, and in my case, it is. And then next, you're going to attach the MonoDevelop or Visual Studio, and in MonoDevelop, you're going to go up to the Run menu. And by the way, this is sort of used for various debugging stuff. And in this Run menu, we're going to choose Attach to Process. And it just lists Unity straight in there for us, usually pretty easy unless you have multiple versions of Unity running. And then you just hit Attach. And when we do, we're going to see that this changes a little bit. We get some buttons up at the top and a few windows down at the bottom. So we're now sort of in debugging mode. And if you want to do this in Visual Studio, then it's under the Debug menu. And you go down to Attach to Process, and it's actually going to list, because Visual Studio is meant to work with a lot of different things, it's going to list sort of every running process on your computer. So you just want to go and find Unity in that list. So at this point, we've created a breakpoint, and we've gone up and attached ourselves to Unity. So now all I got to do is go over to Unity and hit play. And what's going to happen is when Unity executes the line of code that you've marked with a breakpoint, it'll pause. So in our case, the code in question runs when I hit space. So when I hit enter. So I'll go ahead and do that now. And when I hit enter, we'll see if we pop back over to MonoDevelop that our code is now highlighted. So this shows us that our Unity application is paused. And in fact, if I try and go back over and load Unity, I'm hitting Alt-Tab right now, it actually will not load. We'll get no response out of Unity because Unity is completely paused. And I can show that again. I'm going to hit this play button. We'll come back to this in a second. Go back over to Unity. If I hit play, and then I hit the Enter key, and then I try and do something in Unity, we're going to see that Unity is totally and completely unresponsive. So Unity is 100% paused right now. And this is exactly what we want. Unity is paused, and we can actually now start to step through our code line by line. Now that we're paused, there's all kinds of cool things we're going to see and things that we can do. So one cool thing is that we can hover over any variable, and we can get its current value. So the value of our value variable right now is false. The value of our home base, we can actually expand, and we can get all kinds of information about our home base transform. So we can get the local scale and all kinds of cool stuff. And this is powerful. It goes down many levels. You can use it to look through all of the elements of an array, all kinds of fun things. Next up, we can actually see all of the current variables that our sort of class is keeping track of at the bottom under this Locals tab. And this, as we've sort of seen earlier, is a reference to the currently running script on the game object in our scene. And under this, we see home base and ship prefab, and so it'll just go through and list sort of in depth, almost recursively, all of the variables that are defined in this debugging class. Next up, we can, for instance, choose a particular variable that we want to watch. So say I want to keep track of this value variable as it changes. So I can go to this, I can right-click, and I can choose Add Watch. And then as I execute my code, it'll keep track of that variable for me, and I can see how that changes. And in addition to seeing all the variables and the state of our class, the state of our object at this time, we can now start to step through the code line by line. And we use the top buttons to do this. And by the way, if you hover over any of these, they'll tell you what they do. So the first thing we can do is we can use this button to step line by line through our code. And at each point, it's going to update the value of the variables that we're dealing with. So if we go to our locals, or if we just hover over something, we can see that our position has been assigned because we executed that code. Now, we can use this next button over to step into. So here we're calling a method. I'm going to step into the method, and then I can execute through the method. And then the next button to that will step out of the method. And when we're done debugging, we can hit the play button, and that's going to stop the pause, and Unity will continue on as normal. So this is obviously very, very cool. Just a sort of couple of gotchas and things that you can run into. If your breakpoint is on a line of code that's not hit, then your code won't pause. So here I have my value set to true. If I set a breakpoint here, this line of code is never going to be called because my value is true, and this will never evaluate. So if I go back over to Unity, and I go ahead and hit play, and hit enter, it's going to go ahead and instantiate all my spaceships, and it's never going to pause. It's never going to hit this breakpoint. So that's something you can run into. Make sure that you set your breakpoint somewhere that is going to be called. One cool thing that we can do with breakpoints is we can actually set conditions for breakpoints. So we can set breakpoints that are only going to hit when certain things are true. So for instance, let's say that in this instantiate ships method, I think something is wonky about my 5th spaceship that I'm instantiating. So what I can do is I can set a breakpoint here. I can right-click on it, and then down at the bottom we'll see breakpoint properties. And in that breakpoint properties, we're going to see a bunch of conditions. I'm actually going to cancel out here. I can't adjust anything right now because I'm in this debugging mode. So I'm going to go back out to the Run menu. I'm going to click Detach. And I'm going to detach from Unity. And then I'm going to right-click, go to breakpoint properties, and I'm going to set break when condition is true. And it's going to allow me to enter a condition. And so, for instance, I have my I variable, and I want to only break when I is equal to 4. And remember, we're 0 indexed, so when I is equal to 4, that's us instantiating the 5th ship. So I click OK. I go up to this run. I attach back to my Unity process. And then if I go ahead and hit play, oh, and by the way, the reason actually that I was not able to adjust the properties was that I was in the middle of playing. Or rather, I was in the middle of pausing Unity. So detaching the process broke that and allowed Unity to continue on and allowed me to make changes. So now that I've set this and I'm ready to go, I've made sure that I'm attached to Unity. I hit play in Unity. I hit the Enter key. And we can see that when we've paused here, I is equal to 4. So we've run through the first 4 instantiations. We're now on the 5th instantiation. And I can just check out, okay, what's the value of my position at this time? What's happening with my ship prefab? What's happening with all my variables? So I can look specifically at the instantiate call for the 5th ship that I'm instantiating in this loop. So these are all kinds of cool things, and having this debugging process can allow you to essentially look at your code in a little bit more depth than you would get with just a debug.log or just kind of looking to see what's happening in the scene. And because that's a lot of content, I'll just step through it all again real quick, just kind of as an overview and a refresher. So what we're doing here is called using a code debugger. And both MonoDevelop and Visual Studio provide code debuggers. Debuggers allow us essentially to pause our code while the game is running. And we can choose breakpoints, and we choose those by clicking over on the left column, and we can do that both in Visual Studio and in MonoDevelop. And our game will pause when it hits those. We can see the local variables when our game is paused. We can choose a variable to watch. And by the way, you see how value has this unknown identifier? It's because value is defined in my update method, and I'm in a different method. So it's just telling me, while I'm in here, I don't know what value is until I get out of here and return. And then there's a couple more things, the call stack and the immediate window, and those we'll look at in a different video. We can set conditions for our breakpoints. So right-click breakpoint properties and choose what's going to happen with that breakpoint. And then we can use these top buttons to step through our code, to step into and out of things, and then to continue on with Unity when we're done being paused. And that, in a nutshell, is how we use the debugger with Unity.